Imagine a place, or picture one, where the map holds blank spaces. Not the kind you'd find on ancient parchment, marked with warnings of dragons, but modern streets with no names, their empty metal signs scrubbed clean. According to some records, the town of Millbrook shouldn't exist, but that's exactly what happened there. Daniel Harper is my name, and the story I'm about to tell you started with a curious discovery in my grandmother's attic. It ended with me standing at the edge of a town that had tried to erase itself from memory. This began 3 months ago. After my grandmother passed away, she left me her house in Massachusetts, a Victorian monstrosity filled with 87 years of accumulated life. I'd been putting off the task of sorting through it all, but the property taxes weren't going to pay themselves. So, I took a leave of absence from my job and headed north. The attic was the last place I tackled. In the weak light filtering through the single dormer window, dust motes danced as I sifted through trunks of clothing, boxes of holiday decorations, and stacks of photo albums. That's when I found it, the locked wooden box. It wasn't particularly ornate, just a rectangular container about the size of a bread box, fitted with a simple brass lock. Taped to the bottom was the key, wrapped in a yellowed note. "Some truths should stay buried," it read. "But if you found this, perhaps it's time someone remembered." Inside, I found a leather-bound journal, a folded map, and a small cloth bag. Inside the bag was what looked like a piece of a street sign, just a corner with the partial letter M visible. The journal had belonged to my great-grandfather, Thomas Harper. I knew almost nothing about him, except that he'd been a civil engineer. The first entry was dated April 3, 1923. "I've accepted the commission from the Millbrook Development Corporation. The pay is extraordinary, enough to set Alina and the children up comfortably for years. Mr. Whitaker was most insistent that I begin immediately. The town is to be built according to very specific plans. I've never seen anything quite like them." I flipped through the journal, scanning entries. Thomas had been hired to design and oversee the construction of an entire town from scratch, Millbrook, a planned community in western Massachusetts. What struck me as odd was how specific the requirements were, particularly about the street layout. May 17, 1923. The street plan continues to confound me. Mr. Whitaker insists that the roads must follow these precise angles and intersections. When I suggested a more efficient grid pattern, he became quite agitated. "The design is not arbitrary," he said. "The pattern must be maintained exactly as specified." As Thomas's work continued, his entries grew more detailed, but also more concerned. The investors behind the Millbrook Development Corporation were shadowy figures who rarely visited the site, instead sending precise, non-negotiable instructions. July 8, 1923. The naming convention for the streets is peculiar. Mr. Whitaker provided a list of names that must be used in a specific order radiating out from the town center. They appear to be nonsensical: Mackin Avenue, Durrett Street, Chambers Road, not the usual presidential names or tree varieties one might expect. When I inquired about their significance, Whitaker merely said they were benefactors of the project. I paused my reading and unfolded the map stored with the journal. It showed a detailed street plan of Millbrook, each road meticulously labeled. The layout wasn't a grid as you'd expect in a planned town, but something more organic, almost like a pattern or symbol when viewed from above. The streets radiated out from a central plaza with odd angles and curved roads that seemed to serve no practical purpose. Intrigued, I returned to the journal. October 30, 1923. Construction proceeds ahead of schedule. The workers are well paid and efficient, though several have commented on the unusual design. Yesterday, I overheard two of them discussing the road layout. "It's like a giant symbol," one said. "My grandfather would recognize it. He had books about such things." Before I could inquire further, they noticed me and fell silent. Thomas's entries continued as the town took shape through 1924. Houses were built, shops established, and residents began to move in. The Millbrook Development Corporation had a strict vetting process for who was allowed to purchase property, many of the first residents seeming to have connections to the mysterious investors. February 14, 1925. Eleanor is concerned about my preoccupation with the Millbrook project. I've tried to explain that something about the town's design troubles me, but I can't articulate why. Last night, I dreamt I was standing in the central plaza looking up at the street signs and all the names began to bleed, the letters dripping down like crimson paint. I woke in a cold sweat. As I read deeper, Thomas's writing became more disturbed. He'd completed the initial construction but stayed on as town engineer, overseeing maintenance and expansion. He moved his family, my grandmother would have been a small child then, to a house just outside Millbrook. September 5, 1927. I've been mapping the ley lines, as the book from Miskatonic University's library suggested. There's no denying it now. The street pattern aligns perfectly. This town wasn't designed for people. It's a gate, or perhaps a lock. The journal entries became less frequent after that. Thomas wrote about observing the town, noting strange occurrences, unusual gatherings in the central plaza on specific dates, residents who moved in but were never seen during daylight hours, the way fog seemed to linger in certain intersections regardless of the weather. Then came an entry that sent a chill down my spine. March 22, 1931. I confronted Whitaker today with what I've discovered. The street names aren't arbitrary. They're names from the ascendant texts. Each one corresponds to a boundary between our world and something else. He didn't deny it. Instead, he smiled and said, "You've come further than we expected, Harper. Perhaps there's a place for you in the inner circle after all." I refused, of course. I have to protect Eleanor and little Margaret. We'll leave as soon as I can make arrangements. But they didn't leave. The next entry was dated 2 weeks later. April 7, 1931. They're watching the house. Men in dark coats stand on the corner day and night. Eleanor saw one peering through our kitchen window yesterday. Margaret came home from school in tears because her teacher told her that children who try to leave Millbrook get taken by the Hollow Man. I've hidden my research in the cellar and told Eleanor to pack only essentials. We will slip away after midnight. The next entry wasn't for nearly a year. February 18, 1932. We've settled in Boston. I've taken a position with a construction firm under a different name. I still wake up screaming some nights. Eleanor pretends not to notice the symbols I compulsively draw and then destroy. Margaret asks when we're going home. God help me. But sometimes I feel pulled back toward Millbrook, like a compass needle seeking north. The entries became sporadic, Thomas noting strange occurrences, people he recognized from Millbrook appearing in Boston, unusual patterns in missing persons reports, weather phenomena that mirrored events he'd documented. Then came a frantic entry. October 31, 1937. They found us. A letter arrived today addressed to my real name, though we've been living as the Clarks for 5 years now. Inside was a street sign fragment, the corner of Durerith Street, and a note. The pattern is weakening. Your expertise is required. I burned the note, but I cannot burn the sign piece. Something prevents me. The pull toward Millbrook grows stronger. The entries after that documented Thomas's gradual descent into either madness or a terrible clarity. He wrote of dreams where he walked Millbrook streets at night, the buildings looming impossibly tall, the street signs glowing with an inner light. May 4, 1938. I've begun corresponding with others who escaped Millbrook. There aren't many of us. A shopkeeper named Daniels, a school teacher called Miss Winters, and Dr. Finch, who ran the town's only medical practice. They all feel it, too. The pull, the dreams, the sense that something is coming to fruition in that cursed place. Thomas and his fellow refugees, as he called them, exchanged information, piecing together the true purpose of Millbrook. According to his increasingly disturbing entries, the town had been built as a kind of antenna or focusing device. The specific street layout, when viewed from above, formed a complex symbol meant to weaken the boundaries between dimensions. September 15, 1939. The signs are unmistakable. War has begun in Europe. The old texts were clear. When the world is again bathed in blood, the door will be ready to open. Millbrook was always meant for this moment. The street names are keys, each one named for a guardian that must be propitiated before the final gate can open. As the war escalated, Thomas's entries became more frantic. He wrote about returning to Millbrook in secret, observing from the surrounding woods as strange rituals took place in the town square. June 18, 1941. America will enter the war soon. Everyone can feel it coming. And when that happens, when American blood joins the flow, the conditions will be perfect. Miss Winters infiltrated a gathering at the old Whitaker mansion. They're planning something for midsummer 1942. The final alignment, they called it. We cannot allow it to proceed. The next entries detailed an audacious plan. Thomas and his fellow escapees had determined the street names themselves were part of the power of the place, each one a word of power from some forgotten language. If the names could be removed or altered, it might disrupt the ritual. December 8, 1941. Pearl Harbor has been attacked. America is at war. We have no more time to deliberate. The plan must be executed before the solstice. The following entries documented their desperate sabotage. Under cover of night, they snuck into Millbrook with tools and acid, defacing and removing street signs. January 3, 1942. We succeeded in altering or removing 17 of the 23 crucial signposts. Daniels was captured on Macon Avenue. I heard his screams as I fled into the woods. Miss Winters and I barely escaped. The acid I used to deface the sign burned through my gloves. The scars will never heal, I fear. The final entries became increasingly paranoid. Thomas wrote about being pursued, about shadows that moved independently, about whispers in the walls. The last full entry was dated May 30, 1942. They're closing in. Dr. Finch took his own life yesterday rather than be captured. Miss Winters has disappeared. I'm leaving this record and the map with Margaret for safekeeping before I make my final journey. I return to Millbrook tonight to finish what we started. The summer solstice approaches and they will try to replace the signs before then. I cannot allow it. If I do not return, know that I died attempting to close a door that should never have been opened. That was the final entry. My grandmother, Margaret, would have been about 20. She never spoke of her father except to say he'd died during the war, which I'd always assumed meant he'd been a soldier. I sat in that dusty attic for a long time, the journal in my lap, wondering if my great-grandfather had lost his mind, or if something genuinely sinister had happened. The rational part of me insisted this was delusion or an elaborate fiction. But another part, the part that shivers when the wind howls at night, wasn't so sure. Curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for any reference to Millbrook, Massachusetts. Nothing came up. I expanded my search to historical records and found a single mention in a 1943 Regional Gazette. The previously scheduled incorporation of Millbrook Township has been indefinitely postponed due to irregularities in the municipal boundary survey. That was it. A town that had existed for nearly 20 years had simply vanished from record. I couldn't let it go. I took a week to finish settling my grandmother's affairs, then packed my car for what I told myself would be a brief investigative trip. I had Thomas's map, faded and yellowed, but still legible. If Millbrook had existed, I could find where it had been. The drive took me into western Massachusetts through increasingly rural areas until I was navigating winding country roads. According to the map, Millbrook should have been nestled in a small valley. As I crested a hill, my GPS lost signal. I continued following my paper map until I reached what should have been the outskirts of town. There was nothing there but forest and a single rutted dirt road. I almost turned back, but I'd come too far. I parked and continued on foot, map in hand. After about 20 minutes, the trees began to thin, and I found myself on the edge of a large, geometrically regular clearing. And there in the center were the unmistakable remnants of a small town. Most buildings were reduced to foundations, nature reclaiming the space. But the street grid was still visible, paths of packed earth where roads had once run. I checked my map. I was standing approximately where Durerith Street should have begun. Looking down, I noticed something half buried, a rusted street sign mounting bracket. My heart racing, I followed the ghost streets deeper into the remains. I found evidence of hasty destruction, a cracked stone fountain, the charred skeleton of a municipal building, a church with its steeple toppled. But the most unsettling discovery was the Whittaker mansion. Unlike most structures, substantial portions remained intact. I hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of how alone I was. No one knew where I was. Still, I stepped through the doorless entrance into a grand foyer littered with debris. Against the far wall stood a surviving bookcase. Most volumes were ruined, but one book caught my eye, its leather binding still relatively intact. I carefully worked it free. It was a ledger containing minutes of meetings held by the Millbrook Convergence Society. I flipped through brittle pages, scanning entries. Most were mundane, but interspersed were cryptic references to the pattern, the approaching alignment, and the thinning. Then I found an entry dated June 22, 1942, after Thomas's final journal entry. Emergency session called to address the crisis. Street markers in 17 critical nodes have been destroyed or defaced by Harper and his accomplices. Harper himself was captured attempting to sabotage the central convergence point and has been dealt with accordingly. However, the damage is extensive. The alignment occurs tonight and there is insufficient time to reconstruct the failed nodes. After extensive debate, the Society has voted 7-2 to proceed with the calling, despite the compromised pattern. Whittaker assures us that while the result may not be precisely what was originally intended, the fundamental thinning will still occur. The final entry was dated June 23, 1942, written in a shaky hand. The pattern failed. The thinning occurred but was not properly directed. The entity emerged partially but could not fully manifest due to the damaged street alignment. Those closest to the central convergence were. I cannot describe what happened to them. Those of us who survived vote unanimously to abandon Millbrook immediately. The damaged pattern has created an unstable convergence point that cannot be repaired. Government authorities will be told there was a fire. No records of Millbrook shall be preserved. May God forgive us for what we attempted. I closed the ledger, my hands trembling. Whatever these people had attempted, my great-grandfather had disrupted it, possibly at the cost of his life. A sound outside snapped me back to the present, a cracking twig. Then another, closer, followed by whispers. I wasn't alone. Moving quietly, I slipped the ledger into my backpack and crept to a window. Peering through the empty frame, I saw 3 figures moving methodically through the overgrown plaza. They were dressed in hiking clothes, but their movements were too coordinated. One held a surveying instrument, another consulted a map similar to mine, a third hammered small metal markers into the ground. I ducked back inside as one looked toward the mansion. I needed to leave. I made my way to a partially collapsed rear exit. Just as I reached it, I heard voices inside. They'd followed me in. I slipped outside and crouched behind a crumbled wall. Someone's been here recently, a man's voice said. Footprints in the dust and the Whittaker ledger is missing. Could be urban explorers, another replied. No, the first said firmly. Look at this. Someone's been comparing the site to an original map. Shall I call it in? Asked a third voice, a woman's. Yes. Tell them we may have a Harper situation. We need to accelerate the timetable. A Harper situation. They knew my name, or my great-grandfather's. This wasn't a coincidence. I didn't wait to hear more. Staying low, I moved from cover to cover toward the tree line, then broke into a run. I burst out onto the road, fumbled for my keys, and peeled away. In my rearview mirror, I saw two figures emerge from the trees, simply watching me drive away. I drove without stopping until I reached a town with cell service. At a diner, I uploaded scans of the journal and ledger to a cloud storage account. Whatever was happening, I wanted evidence to exist. That night, in a motel room, I reviewed everything. My great-grandfather had helped build a town designed as a mystical mechanism. And now, more than 80 years later, someone was back. I barely slept. The next day, I visited an architectural historian at MIT. I showed her the map. "This is unusual," she said. "Planned towns from this era typically used grid patterns. This organic layout would have been extremely costly. There's almost a mathematical precision to the irregularity." She showed me a book on experimental communities based on theosophical principles, their street patterns having similarities to Millbrook's. My next stop was less conventional. Dr. Elliot, a professor of comparative mythology who studied occult geometry. I showed him the map. His reaction was immediate and visceral. He stared at it, then abruptly locked his office door. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice tight. After I explained, he sat back down, tense. "Mr. Harper, this map depicts what occultists would call a summoning circuit. This particular design is sophisticated, dangerously so." He pointed to the central plaza. "This is a convergence point. These radiating streets are arranged to create a thinning effect in the dimensional barrier. You're saying this town was designed to contact something from another dimension?" "Not just contact," he said grimly. "Summon. Bring through. Create a permanent doorway." He showed me a worn book with a diagram showing elements of the Millbrook street plan. "I've seen fragments of this pattern before. According to this, a complete implementation would create a permanent aperture between realities." I told him about Thomas's sabotage and the apparent catastrophe. "Your great-grandfather may have saved countless lives," Dr. Elliot said. "But something still happened. The ledger said the entity emerged partially. If the process was interrupted, it could have created an unstable situation, a partial thinning that never properly closed. And wounds can be reopened," I suggested. "Exactly." As I was leaving, Dr. Elliot grabbed my arm. "Mr. Harper, be careful. The kind of people who pursue this knowledge don't take kindly to interference." That night, I decided to check the county records office nearest to Millbrook. I found that several parcels adjacent to the site had been purchased by New Convergence Development LLC. The contact person was a Dr. Alan Whitaker. The company was owned by the Ascendant Heritage Foundation. The name echoed the Ascendant texts from Thomas's journal. They were operating in the open, behind a corporate veneer. I needed to document what was happening at the site. I purchased camping gear and a camera with a telephoto lens. My plan was to hike in from the north and set up an observation post. The next morning, I reached a fire watch tower overlooking the clearing. Through my telephoto lens, I could see a dozen people moving through the former streets. They had cleared the vegetation, revealing the foundations and the ghostly grid. In the central plaza, a geodesic dome covered the convergence point. Around the perimeter, others were placing metal poles, recreating the street grid in 3 dimensions. Most chillingly, they were installing actual street signs, exact replicas. I zoomed in on one, Mashian Avenue. They were rebuilding Millbrook, exactly. I was so focused I almost missed the footsteps on the tower stairs. I swung over the railing onto an exterior maintenance ladder just as a man reached the platform. I clung to the outside, holding still. Central point to observation post. Status report. "All clear," the man above me replied. "No activity on the north approach." "Any sign of our visitor from yesterday?" "Negative. Local police are monitoring his vehicle. Assessment team believes he's a Harper descendant." The resemblance was noted. Keep observation protocols active. Convergence is scheduled in 3 days. We can't risk another interference. Once he settled in, I began my slow, careful descent. It took 20 minutes to reach the ground. I didn't look back. They were planning their convergence in 3 days. I drove back to Boston and met Dr. Elliot. "It's worse than I thought," he said. "The configuration is an exact match to ancient texts. They're planning this for the summer solstice." The man at the tower had said 3 days. It matched. "We need to disrupt the pattern directly, just as your great-grandfather did," Dr. Elliot said. "I think I may have a way," I said, and told him about the sign fragment. I had a neighbor overnight it from my grandmother's house. When it arrived, Dr. Elliot examined it. "Extraordinary. This material is unlike anything I've seen." He built a small, nullification device that combined the fragment with what he called a disruption circuit. We drove back to the area that afternoon, using a remote hunting cabin as a base. We would approach before dawn via a drainage culvert. Dr. Elliot also had a small drone for a distraction. That night, we crawled through the culvert and emerged in the ruins. The site was alive with activity despite the hour. The dome glowed with a pulsing greenish light. We waited for our moment, then Dr. Elliot launched the drone. When it emitted a high-frequency pulse, causing confusion, we ran for the dome. He cut a slit in the fabric and we slipped inside. The space seemed larger than possible. At the center was a dark stone platform inscribed with symbols, surrounded by 9 metal poles bearing the street signs. Hanging above it was a sphere of liquid darkness, rotating slowly, absorbing the light. "My God," Dr. Elliot breathed. "They've already initiated the thinning." As he stepped onto the platform with the nullification device, a voice came from behind us. "I wouldn't do that, Doctor." We turned. A tall, thin man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes stood there. "Whitaker, I presume," Dr. Elliot said. "Alan Whitaker," the man confirmed. "And you would be Dr. James Elliot, and Mr. Daniel Harper. Your resemblance to your great-grandfather is remarkable." "What you're doing is dangerous," I said. "On the contrary," Whitaker replied calmly, "we know exactly what we're calling. The entity has been waiting since 1942, existing in a state of partial emergence. We're simply completing what was started." As he spoke, the sphere pulsed, expanding slightly. Dr. Elliot glanced at me, then lunged forward, thrusting the device into the center of the sphere. The sphere collapsed, then exploded outward in a wave of darkness. The dome rippled, the metal poles vibrated violently. Whitaker screamed. "Run!" Dr. Elliot shouted, pulling me toward the entrance. "The reaction is destabilizing the entire pattern." We stumbled out into chaos. The floodlights were failing, workers were fleeing, poles were toppling. A low rumble emanated from the ground. We ran for the trees. When we looked back, the dome was collapsing, torn by invisible claws. The sphere pulsed erratically, throwing off arcs of energy. Did we stop it? I gasped. Not exactly, Dr. Elliot said grimly. We've destabilized the convergence, but the thinning had already begun. What we're seeing is a dimensional rupture. A concussive wave threw us to the forest floor. A blast of hot air passed over us. Then, a profound silence. We made our way back to the cabin. The nullification device worked better than I could have hoped, Dr. Elliot said. The fragment's properties created a dissonance the pattern couldn't sustain. Will they try again? Perhaps, but we've destroyed their implementation and disrupted their timing. Your great-grandfather would be proud. In the weeks that followed, the Ascendant Heritage Foundation dissolved. The property was donated to the state. Of Alan Whitaker and his team, there was no sign. I returned to my grandmother's house and found one final item among Thomas's papers, a letter dated June 24, 1942. If you are reading this, then I have failed to return. The pattern must never be completed. Remember, the names are the key. Without them, the streets are just paths, the town just buildings. With them, they become a circuit, a machine built for a terrible purpose. Keep watch. They will try again. And so I do keep watch. Dr. Elliot and I monitor the site. But sometimes in the dark hours of the night, I wonder, did we truly stop what was coming, or merely delay it? The entity that was partially manifested in 1942, where is it now? Does it wait between realities, growing stronger? I wonder about the streets of Millbrook, slowly being reclaimed by nature. What power did those names hold? What might they have summoned if spoken in the right sequence, at the right time, in the right place? Some questions are better left unanswered. Some names better left unspoken. Some towns better left unbuilt. My name is Daniel Harper, and I've told you a story about a place that tried to erase itself from memory. A town with streets that once had names, names that were all erased by 1942. For good reason.